Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the expulsion from the garden as we continue our series through the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 3, the first half of this chapter, verses 1 through 6, speak of the events leading up to the fall. We saw the serpent introduced, and then there were the temptations, and finally the woman took from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. She ate, and the man with her ate. Then in Verse 7, we see that God shows up, the results of the fall. He shows up, he questions both the man and the woman, and then we have the curse of sin. And now we're going to look at the coats of skin, and then finally the banishment from the garden. Chapter 3, verse 21, the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife, and clothed them. Now, we're not told how God did this. He could have just, just like he did the rest of creation, spoken, and there were just suddenly coats of skin there. But the hint, I think the suggestion here, is that in order to make garments of skin, he had to take some animal and put that animal to death in order to take the skin for Adam and his wife in order to clothe them of their nakedness. So there's a suggestion that this would have been done by the shedding of blood. And indeed, when we get to the next chapter, we're going to see Abel bringing forth the firstlings of his flock as a sacrifice. That sacrificial idea will already be implanted in the human race, and I think it begins right here. As animals are taken, maybe just one animal, but an animal is taken and the skin is taken and it is put to death. There's a sense in which we see in that animal an innocent substitute, because the animal hadn't done anything wrong. It had been Adam and his wife, Adam and Eve, who had eaten of the forbidden fruit. They are the ones who had sinned, and yet this animal is put to death in their place. That replaces the fig leaves that they had tried to utilize in order to cover their own nakedness. That had been an inadequate clothing, and so their own self-effort is put aside, and God instead clothes them with that which he provides, that which he provided by the death of an innocent substitute. And of course, it's a wonderful picture of what Jesus would do for us. He gives himself. He is our substitute who dies in our place. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 3 says, "For we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed." You see, the whole issue is dealing with clothing. The Adam and Eve had realized their own nakedness, and they had sought to clothe themselves with fig leaves. That didn't work very well. And likewise, verse 2, "For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven." We still long for a type of clothing, inasmuch as we, having put it on, will not be found naked. Paul goes on to say in verse 4, "For indeed while we were in this tent we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but to be clothed, so that what is mortal will be swallowed up by life." We still long for and hunger for a better clothing. Our own fig leaves aren't good enough. We want an eternal clothing, that which is going to be swallowed up when this mortal passes away. In Luke chapter 24, verse 49, Jesus talked about how he's speaking to his disciples, said, "I'm sending forth the promise of my Father upon you, but you are to stay in the city until you are clothed with power from on high." There's a certain clothing that the church receives when we believe. It's a clothing of God's Spirit, which is promissory of an eternal clothing to follow. Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now he might stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he was taken. So man's going to be cast out of the garden to prevent him from taking of the tree of life. And you say, well, hadn't he already eaten of the tree of life? I think he had. But if he continued to eat of the tree of life, he would continue to live, and he's removed from the garden so that he might be removed from the tree of life, so that he might die. So he drove the man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he stationed the cherubim. Notice it's plural, the eem is plural, a cherub is singular, cherubim are plural, two of them. He stationed the cherubim and the flaming sword which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. So man is driven out of the garden. Now, when we look at the story of Adam and Eve and they're removed from the garden, Adam's been banished from the garden. Remember that the ones reading this story for the first time, this is Moses writing to the people of Israel who have departed from the Garden of Egypt. Once you leave Egypt, Egypt's a very well-watered place. You leave Egypt and you're out in the desert. And now they're in the Sinai wilderness because they've left a garden-like place. In the case of Adam, he leaves the garden by the eastern route. Likewise, the people of Israel left Egypt going east into the Sinai Peninsula. And now, as they're in the wilderness, they have received the tabernacle. They have a place of worship. And that tabernacle pictures the Garden of Eden. Notice the things that you see in and around the tabernacle. First of all, there's a flaming altar. Reminds us of a flaming sword that kept man out of the garden. And that flaming altar was on the east side of the tabernacle compound. Next, there is water, a laver of water that represents the cleansing which must take place in order for the priests to go to and fro from the tabernacle. And finally, when you go into the tabernacle itself, there's a stylized tree, a tree of light, that's the lampstand, a tree of life. There's also bread, a table of bread depicting that which they were able to eat. And yet now, outside of the garden, man's going to have to labor for his bread. He's going to fight the earth for the bread. And finally, when you go into the innermost part of that tabernacle, there's the Ark of the Covenant with statues of two cherubim, two of these mighty winged creatures that are serving as honor guard. And so all of the accoutrements of Eden are found in the tabernacle.